They say you don't truly know a person until you give them the power to destroy you. My name is Evelyn, and for 3 years I lived a lie. I played the role of the ordinary wife to a man who thought his ambition made him untouchable. When he finally stood on a stage and humiliated me in front of our city's elite, he thought he was ending my life. He had no idea that I was the primary investor in the firm he worked for, and that his public breakup was the exact moment his professional life ended. This is the story of how I dismantled his world, piece by piece.
If you enjoy stories about calculated justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button to follow my journey. And before we dive in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below.
The grand ballroom at the St. Regis in Manhattan hummed with the kind of calculated energy that only exists in high-stakes corporate circles. Crystal chandeliers caught the light of 1,000 camera flashes, and the room smelled of expensive cologne, dry champagne, and desperate ambition. I stood at the edge of the dais, blending into the mahogany-paneled shadows, watching the man I was still legally tied to. Julian looked the part. He always did. He wore his tailored Italian suit like armor, his smile practiced, his jaw set in that specific, humble position he reserved for photographers. He held the Executive of the Year trophy, a heavy, cold slab of glass, as if it were a religious artifact. The room erupted in applause. It was a symphony of sycophants. They cheered because they had to, or because they were afraid of missing out on a future favor. He approached the microphone, and the room quieted instantly. This was the moment he had been orchestrating for the last 18 months, the culmination of every predatory business merger and backdoor deal he had pulled off.
"Thank you," Julian said, his voice smooth, devoid of any genuine warmth. He scanned the room, making eye contact with the board members, the potential investors, the press. He was selling a narrative, and they were buying it. Success isn't a solo endeavor. It requires balance. It requires the right foundation. He paused, looking toward my corner. I didn't flinch. I just smoothed the fabric of my dress, keeping my expression neutral, carefully constructed to reflect the ordinary spouse he wanted the public to see. "Evelyn," he said, gesturing with a grace that felt practiced. "Come up here, would you?" I walked to the center of the stage. The heat from the spotlights was intense, but I didn't feel the warmth. I felt only the weight of the silence. Julian stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. It felt like a branding iron. "I've spent years building a legacy," he began, his voice dropping an octave, turning intimate for the audience. "But growth requires evolution. Evelyn is a sweet girl. She has been a comfort." He let out a soft, dismissive chuckle that rippled through the front rows. "But the reality of my position, of the firm's trajectory, she's a PR liability. My career is ascending, and I can't afford to have an ordinary spouse holding me back, tethered to the past." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. He didn't stop. "Today, I'm filing for divorce," he announced, his tone as casual as if he were discussing a minor stock fluctuation. "I need someone who actually adds value to my brand, someone who understands the velocity of the life I'm living." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a collapse. The journalists were frozen, their cameras clicking in a frantic, uncoordinated mess. The board members shifted in their seats, unsure if they should applaud his boldness or look at the floor. It was a masterclass in public cruelty. Julian looked down at me, waiting for the tears, the outburst, the predictable collapse of a woman who had been humiliated in front of the city's elite. He wanted the scene. He wanted the drama. I looked back. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single tremor in my voice. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool, steady rhythm of my own heart. I saw the flash of confusion in his eyes, a flicker of annoyance that I hadn't played my part correctly. I leaned into the microphone, my voice steady, barely a whisper,
yet clear enough to cut through the stillness. "Understood, Julian."
I didn't argue. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply turned and walked off the stage. I kept my back straight, my stride measured, crossing the expanse of the ballroom. I could feel 1,000 eyes on my spine, tracking my exit. Behind me, Julian stood frozen, the trophy heavy in his hands, suddenly aware that the silence wasn't admiration. It was judgment. He thought he had discarded me. He thought he had successfully cut the anchor. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor I had spent the last year meticulously unlocking. I walked toward the exit, my mind already 3 steps ahead, drafting the first email to my legal team. The game hadn't ended. It had just officially begun. The night air in Manhattan was biting, a sharp, cold contrast to the stifling, perfume-heavy heat of the ballroom. My driver, Marcus, held the door to the Lincoln Continental open. I slid into the back seat, the leather interior cool against my skin. My phone buzzed immediately. 3 messages from Julian in the span of 30 seconds. They were frantic, a mix of posturing and damage control. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about the optics of a messy separation. I swiped the notifications away and blocked his number. The silence in the car was finally, mercifully, mine. People often assume that wealth is a static state, a fixed destination. They don't understand that for my family, wealth is an infrastructure. 3 years ago, the Everest name was more of a burden than a privilege. My father, the CEO of Everest Holdings, had looked at me across his desk in our headquarters and posed a question that would define my trajectory for the next 1,000 days. "You want a partner, Evelyn? Then stop being a target for opportunists. Go live as someone with nothing. If he stays when there's no equity to gain, he's yours. If he doesn't, you have your answer." That was the experiment. I moved into a standard, cramped apartment in the Upper West Side, took an administrative role at a mid-tier logistics firm, and effectively shed my pedigree. I wasn't just hiding my money, I was testing the integrity of the people who entered my orbit. I met Julian at a networking mixer 6 months into the experiment. To the outside world, he was the picture of a rising executive, ambitious, hungry, and polished. At first, I thought he was the outlier. He was attentive. He listened to my ideas about market efficiency, and for a while I let myself believe that his interest was genuine. I wanted to believe there was substance beneath the suit. But the mask always slips when you stop feeding it the right audience. Over the months, the cracks appeared. He didn't care about the logistics work I performed. He cared about the connections he thought he could squeeze out of the people I interacted with. He viewed relationships as transactions. Every dinner, every conversation was a ledger entry. He didn't pass the integrity test. He failed it by an embarrassing margin. I stayed, however. I didn't stay because I was blinded by love. I stayed because I was observing. I wanted to see exactly how far his lack of character would take him. I wanted to know if a man like that could ever be salvaged, or if his ambition was a terminal disease. He proved it was the latter. Tonight, his public humiliation of me wasn't just a divorce announcement. It was the final data point I needed to complete my assessment. I looked out the window as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and neon. Julian thought he was the predator. He thought he was the shark circling a goldfish, unaware that I was the one who had built the tank he was swimming in. He had spent years maneuvering for a seat at the table of a company he thought was independent, never once realizing who truly held the majority shares. He treated our marriage like a stepping stone, never suspecting that the stone was actually a trapdoor. Marcus pulled the car to a stop in front of my private brownstone. I sat for a moment, letting the adrenaline of the evening settle into a cold, precise focus. I wasn't hurt. You can't be hurt by someone you've already deconstructed. I unlocked my phone and opened the encrypted folder on my cloud drive. It was labeled Project Equity. Inside were the files, the emails, the forged expense reports, the backdoor deals he had made, and the records of his recent, unauthorized merger talks. Julian wanted to get rid of the ordinary spouse who was holding him back. He had no idea he was about to get exactly what he deserved: a total, absolute reset. I got out of the car, the city wind whipping through my coat. I had a long night of planning ahead, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't pretending to be anything other than exactly who I was. The morning after the gala, the sunlight hitting my office floor was cold and clinical. I didn't reach for tissues or spend the morning analyzing Julian's public cruelty. Those were the reactions of a victim, and I had spent the last 3 years playing the role of a wife, not a subject. I walked into my walk-in closet, the one I had kept hidden behind a false panel in our brownstone, and looked at the clothes I had worn for the experiment. Soft fabrics, muted colors, clothes designed to blend into the background of a mid-tier logistics office. I pushed them aside. I reached for the charcoal-tailored suit I had commissioned months ago. It was quiet luxury at its finest, structured, sharp, and designed to command a room without saying a word. It wasn't about looking powerful, it was about looking like I belonged in the seat of authority. As I buttoned the jacket, I felt the familiar weight of control. I wasn't the wife who held him back anymore. I was the silent partner, the primary investor, and the architect of his impending reality. I sat at my desk and opened the secure terminal. While Julian was out playing the role of the executive of the year, he had been reckless. Ambition without due diligence is just a liability, and Julian was a liability personified. I pulled up the corporate records for his current firm. For the last year, I hadn't just been observing our marriage, I had been auditing his department. He was sloppy. He assumed that because I was his spouse, I was his blind spot. He forwarded emails, left sensitive documents in our shared cloud, and bragged about backdoor deals over dinner, thinking I was just a sympathetic ear. He didn't realize he was narrating his own downfall. He had embezzled funds to inflate his quarterly earnings, falsified vendor contracts to secure a kickback, and most damningly, he had violated the moral clause of his executive contract by engaging in a hostile takeover attempt without board approval. I spent the next 6 hours refining the evidence. I didn't need to yell or threaten. I just needed the truth, organized into a package that would be impossible for the board to ignore. I created a timeline, cross-referenced his emails with his financial filings, and highlighted every instance where his personal ambition directly conflicted with company policy. It was a systematic deconstruction. I wasn't just planning to fire him. I was planning to dismantle his professional credibility so thoroughly that he would never work in the sector again. I didn't want him to just lose his job. I wanted him to lose the prestige he had traded his integrity for. By late afternoon, the file was complete. It sat on my screen, a dense, damning document of his hubris. I made a single call to the law firm I kept on retainer, the ones we called the Sharks. They didn't do divorce law. They did corporate annihilation. "The file is ready," I said when the senior partner answered. My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of the sweet tone I had used with Julian for 3 years. "It's all there. The embezzlement, the forged contracts, the unauthorized merger attempts, everything." "We are ready, Evelyn," the partner replied. "The legal infrastructure is in place. We have the leverage to trigger the clause the moment he steps into the building on Monday. He won't know what hit him until the security guards are escorting him out." "Good," I said. "He thinks he's the one firing me. Let him believe that until the very last second." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline. The city looked different from this vantage point. It wasn't a place of opportunity anymore. It was a map of his mistakes. Julian had spent 18 months building a pedestal of lies, and he had invited the entire city to watch him stand on it. He didn't realize that in my world, there is no such thing as an ordinary spouse. There are only investors, and when the investment turns toxic, you don't save it, you liquidate it. I was ready for Monday. The storm was coming, and he was the only one who didn't see the clouds. Monday morning usually hummed with a specific, aggressive ambition at the firm. For Julian, this wasn't just the start of another work week, it was coronation day. He walked through the glass double doors of the headquarters with his head held high,
his stride rhythmic and confident. He didn't nod to the administrative staff. He didn't even acknowledge the receptionist. He was already living in the headspace of a CEO, already visualizing the plaque with his name on the office he'd spent 2 years plotting to occupy. He moved toward the boardroom, his hand already reaching for the handle of the heavy mahogany doors. He had prepared his speech, a carefully crafted monologue about market expansion and operational efficiency that he planned to deliver to the board. He expected to see the familiar faces of the directors, men he had manipulated and courted for months, waiting for him with pens poised to sign the contract that would finalize his promotion. Julian pushed the doors open. He took a single step inside, his smile already forming, his posture perfected for the cameras he assumed would be there to document his rise. Then he stopped. The room wasn't filled with the sycophantic board members he expected. The table was silent. The directors sat in their chairs, their gazes fixed firmly on the head of the table, their expressions devoid of the warmth he had spent months cultivating. They weren't looking at him. They were waiting for someone else. I was sitting in the center seat, the seat reserved for the majority owner, the seat he had been drooling over for 18 months. I had my tablet open, reviewing the quarterly projections. My legal counsel sat to my right, a thick, organized file open before him. Julian's hand remained on the door handle. His smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated, replaced by a confusion so profound it looked almost comical. "What is this?" he stammered, stepping further into the room. "What are you doing here, Evelyn? This is an executive board meeting. You don't have security clearance for this." I didn't look up from my tablet immediately. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, uncomfortable moment. The weight of it pressed down on him, forcing him to realize that the power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. I finally closed the tablet and looked at him. My expression was perfectly neutral, cool, professional, and entirely devoid of the sweet wife persona he had exploited for years. "I'm not here as your spouse, Julian," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm here as the primary stakeholder. You seem to have made a fundamental error in your due diligence. You thought you were maneuvering for a promotion in an independent firm. You were actually working for a subsidiary of my family's holdings." Julian blinked, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "That's impossible. My contracts—" "Your contracts were signed with a shell company that I own." I cut him off, not raising my voice, not needing to. "I didn't just attend our marriage, Julian. I funded the company you work for. And after your public stunt at the gala on Friday, you've triggered a specific clause in your executive contract. It's called the moral clause. It covers conduct detrimental to the company's brand." He started to argue, his voice rising, but I held up a hand, silencing him instantly. The board members didn't even flinch. They knew who signed their checks. "You're not just losing a wife, Julian," I said, my tone final. "You're losing your job, your reputation, your leverage. You traded a real, stable legacy for a temporary promotion that never existed. Bad investment. Security, please remove him." He stood there, paralyzed, watching his world dismantle in real time. He tried to speak, to offer a rebuttal, to find a way to pivot, but there was nothing left to say. The boardroom doors opened behind him, and the security detail moved in. He had spent his entire career looking for a shortcut to the top, never realizing that he was just a temporary asset in a game he wasn't smart enough to understand. He turned and left, his posture. The shift in Julian's demeanor was instantaneous. The arrogance that had defined his posture for the last 2 years evaporated, replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. It was a physical collapse. He stood by the boardroom door, his expensive Italian loafers suddenly looking like lead weights, and his face took on a sickly gray pallor that didn't match the crispness of his collar. He looked smaller somehow. Without the illusion of the power he thought he held, he was just a man in an expensive suit, stripped of his context. He took a stumbling step toward the table, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out as if to steady himself against the mahogany.
"Evelyn, wait. Let's not be irrational," he stammered, his voice cracking. The polished, executive timbre he had spent years practicing was gone. "We can talk about this. You're angry about the gala. I get it. It was a mistake. Let's step out into the hallway and handle this like adults. You can't just terminate me like this. Think about the shareholders."
He was still trying to bargain. He still thought this was a negotiation, a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right words and a bit of corporate maneuvering. He didn't understand that for me, this wasn't a negotiation. It was an audit, and he had come up deficient.
I didn't blink. I didn't lean forward. I stayed perfectly still, my posture relaxed, holding all the space in the room. The board members sat in complete silence, their expressions carefully neutral. They weren't horrified, they were relieved. They had spent months tolerating his erratic, ego-driven decisions, and they were more than happy to watch him be liquidated. "There's nothing to talk about, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his panic with absolute clarity. "You traded a real legacy for a temporary promotion. You built your entire career on the assumption that you were the smartest person in the room, never checking to see who owned the room itself. That wasn't a mistake. That was an investment error, and in this firm, we don't hold on to that investments." He opened his mouth to protest, to spin a new narrative, to try and gaslight me one last time, but the security team stepped in. They didn't need to be aggressive. Their presence was enough. They flanked him, waiting for my signal. Julian looked around the room, desperately seeking an ally, a sympathetic eye, anything. He found nothing but cold, clinical detachment. He looked back at me, his eyes wide, finally processing the total finality of the moment. He realized then that I wasn't the sweet girl he had manipulated for years. I was the architect of his entire reality, and I had decided that his time was up. "You're making a mistake," he whispered, a final, pathetic attempt at deflection. I looked at him, really looked at him, not with hatred, not with anger, but with the cool, analytical detachment of an investor closing a ledger. I leaned forward, just enough to catch his attention, and dropped my voice to a whisper that was audible to every single person in the boardroom. "You're not a victim, Julian. You're just finished." I gave the guards a small, almost imperceptible nod. They stepped forward, their hands firm on his arms. As they guided him toward the door, Julian didn't fight back. He didn't make a scene. He just let them drag him out, his dignity crumbling with every step. He was losing his status, his access, his prestige, and his future, all because he had been too obsessed with the appearance of success to notice the reality of it. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, sealing him out of the boardroom. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, but it was clean. It was the silence of a problem being solved. I turned my attention back to the files on the table. The restructuring was just beginning, and I had a company to stabilize. The fallout was swift, clinical, and total. In the corporate world of Manhattan, perception is currency, and Julian had just declared bankruptcy. By the time he reached the lobby, his access badges were already deactivated, his corporate email was purged, and the board had issued a brief, sterile press release citing a divergence in strategic vision and a breach of contractual obligations. In an industry where reputations are built on years of calculated maneuvers, Julian's credibility vanished in a single afternoon. He tried to spin it, of course. He attempted to reach out to his network, the venture capitalists, the senior analysts, the industry contacts he had spent years cultivating. But Julian had made the fatal mistake of tying his personal brand too closely to his upward trajectory. Once the trajectory stopped, so did the interest. He wasn't just an executive who lost his job, he was a liability. Within 48 hours, he was radioactive. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had been publicly ousted for a breach of conduct and a gross failure of due diligence. He was effectively locked out of the sector. I didn't watch the news reports. I didn't need to. The data points were clear. Julian was no longer a factor in my market or my life. He had spent his entire existence chasing an image of power, the corner office, the accolades, the arm candy, never realizing that these things were merely shadows. When the source of the light moved, the shadows disappeared.
I returned to my true life with the efficiency of someone closing a complex, long-term trade. I stepped out of the ordinary suburban persona I had worn for 3 years, like one sheds an uncomfortable coat. I returned to the Everest Holdings headquarters, not as the wife of an executive, but as the daughter of the firm, the strategist who had successfully navigated the most difficult social experiment of my career. My father met me in the executive suite. There was no need for grand congratulations. He looked at me, saw the way I held myself, and understood immediately. The experiment was a success, not because I had found a husband, but because I had definitively proven my capacity to protect the legacy. "The audit is complete," I said, placing the final reports on his desk. "The firm is stabilized, and the internal restructuring is proceeding according to plan. The personnel changes have been implemented." He glanced at the papers, then back at me. "And the variable?" he asked, referring to Julian. "The variable has been eliminated," I replied. My tone wasn't cold, it was simply accurate. It was the same tone I used when discussing divestment strategies. He lacked the integrity to sustain the position and the judgment to understand the environment he was operating in. That was the end of it. The 3 years I had invested in the marriage weren't a waste, they were an education. I had learned exactly how people operate when they think they have the upper hand, and I had learned the absolute necessity of maintaining one's own leverage. I was no longer interested in testing the hearts of men. I was interested in building. I looked out over the city from the top floor of the tower. Manhattan looked different now, not as a sprawling, chaotic metropolis, but as a chessboard. I had moved my pieces, secured my position, and effectively checked the board. Julian had lost everything: status, capital, and career, simply because he had been too obsessed with the mask of success to notice the reality of his own fragility. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete canyons. I felt nothing, no regret, no triumph, no lingering resentment. I was simply at peace with the outcome. I had played the long game, and I had won. I wasn't the wife who held him back. I was the strategist who had ensured he never had the substance to move forward in the first place. I turned away from the glass, my mind already pivoting to the next quarter's strategy. My life as an ordinary woman was over, and the real work was just beginning.